Hello, today we will be taking another deep dive into aquaculture as part of our series on technology and AI, where we explore how new tools can support more responsible and transparent management of our oceans. Joining us today is Tony Chen. Tony, welcome to the Natural Justice Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you are the co-founder and CEO of Manolin, a company with a mission to turning aquaculture data into real solutions by making important information from fish farms more actionable.
That's right.
You also wear another hat. Before I actually spoke to you directly, I already was fairly familiar with your work and actually in particular with your voice, since you also have a podcast called Fish and Bits, which I highly recommend to anyone to really give a listen as well. What first motivated you to launch a podcast about aquaculture and its innovation, which is, a common focus in your episodes? And how does this connect to your professional background and Manolin's work?
Maybe it's helpful to answer that question, I can start by talking about my background and how I really got into building the business. And that's really how we ended up in the podcast space as well. So thank you for having me. And my background is a lot in computer science. So I graduated from MIT a little more than a decade ago at this point. And I was my experience was all in technology. So I came out of school, worked in management consulting, where I was trying to advise businesses or understand how technology would change different businesses. And that's really how I stumbled across aquaculture. It was on a random kind of weekend trip, found oyster farmers in the Chesapeake Bay on the east coast of the United States, and really just fell in love with the industry from there. We started our business, Manolin, really focused on how do you help farmers build technology solutions for the future of the industry. And then a few years after that is how we started jumping into the podcast. But the way that we got into it was almost kind of a personal expression of what we would talk about internally at our company. So our team is mostly technology focused folks and come from a lot of different backgrounds. Not too many people come from a deep, ingrained knowledge with the industry. So we've had to do a lot of research, what do you feed animals? How do these farming systems work? How have they developed over time? And these were just internal conversations that we had at our company. But what we really thought was that it was important to share it with the world because there were so many people that started getting interested in this space, whether it's in the industry or outside of the industry. And we felt like we could be kind of a pathway to open up dialogue and conversation around how do we build these new solutions. So really, it's an extension of that. And I think one of the reasons that we felt it was really important is when you look at aquaculture, any industry in the ocean, it's so complicated. Everything matters, whether it's regulation, whether it's, in our industry, biology matters so much. So when you look at regulation, when you look at economics, when you look at biology, when you look at technology, a lot of the solutions require, parts of all of that. And the podcast is a great way for, us to explore really with the industry, what we're talking about internally. How do we solve these problems? How do we make this industry better? And that's really how that evolved and, has grown into a great following, but allows us to really explore some of these areas and raise questions that we can discuss as an industry together, essentially.
Amazing. That actually does remind me of why I started this podcast, which was very much with, being a consultancy, so much of the work. Like, I feel like there's a lot of work that we do or things that I have to research that are very interesting. There's a lot of super interesting people that I get to talk to. But I feel like if you're not really in the sector fully or part of a certain crowd, it's actually really hard to get that information, even though it is just kind of readily available to people. And I thought, what's kind of the most accessible way to bring that to a wider audience, right? Because I think, as so many people that work in seafood, we're very passionate about what we do, and it would be amazing if people understand the sector a little bit better and understand how really nuanced seafood is. And it's really not simple enough that you can express it, even though we're like sometimes trying to, but like with this is good, this is kind of okay, and then this is bad seafood, it's a sector that's constantly innovating and where there's just a lot of nuance. And so, it's amazing to hear that you're really starting that you started it way before I did, actually. I'm relatively new on the scene, but just kind of creating more insights into the work that we do, right? And making that information more available for people.
Absolutely. So many topics can't really be summarized, in just a
Mm-hmm.
one liner, or you really need to dive a little bit deeper. And that's what we thought was important. I mean, you've almost mentioned it, seafood happens around the world. So the other
Mm-hmm.
aspect is, from our technology point of view, how do we connect folks and connect people that we're all in different parts of the world. We see each other, at conferences and stuff, but how can we make that connection even a little bit tighter and be able to have this dialogue at a faster pace?
Yeah, exactly. Amazing. So at the moment, you talk to a lot of both in your work as well as for the podcast, you talk to a lot of experts. You're an expert yourself. So at the moment, what's something you're really obsessing over? What developments or challenges in aquaculture are you particularly excited about?
I mean, I think my answer to this, the first one, I think I have a couple areas that I think are really, really exciting for the sector.
Mm-hmm.
And one is probably one that people are almost tired of talking about at this point, and that would be artificial intelligence. But
Mm-hmm.
I can explain kind of my thoughts behind that. I mean, I think our perspective may be a little different than how people view the word AI, but I think that's the thing we're most excited at Manolin. But it's because we probably would call ourselves an AI company, but
Mm-hmm.
it's back in we would have called ourselves an AI company back in 2015 when all of this work really got started, but I don't think anybody would have known what that means, and nobody knew what AI was until we've seen kind of the new solutions then. But one of the things that we've always been excited for, kind of, my co-founder and I are both computer scientists, and throughout college we learned about different algorithms, different machine learning models, how to build neural nets, and you could see kind of the potential of where these data systems could get to as far as predictability, being able to understand patterns in a different way. It's been applied, in the modern world, mostly to video and to text. But, we saw opportunities to apply it to different industries, and in our case, fish. But that's what we've been working on for the better part of a decade now, is how do you, understand patterns and build predictive analytics out of this information. We call it AI today. Back in the day, it was big data or machine learning. It's all the
Mm-hmm.
same thing at the end of the day, right? It's just statistics and math and numbers, but it's can be applied in a unique way. And that's probably what we're most excited for. In this particular industry, so much data gets generated in aquaculture, but we haven't really figured out how to understand it. And that gets me into kind of the two areas that I think has great potential, and that would be genomics and then diseases. So understanding how diseases spread in the ocean, how it interacts with natural wildlife or fisheries is a big concept and a big key important piece that we're trying to solve and apply AI in that way. Another aspect is just on the genomics side. Most people know aquaculture is a fairly new industry. I think it's quite surprising when I tell people, the industry that we focus on the most is the salmon farming industry. And in that field, we have selectively bred 15 generations of salmon. That's it. When you compare that to poultry or cattle or pigs, it's a very different world, right? We have thousands
Mm-hmm.
and thousands of selectively bred generations of those animals. In this industry, it's fairly new, and it's the same case, around the world in different species. And again, data and AI has a lot of potential there. So I'd say AI and then how it applies to those big categories.
I mean, I can understand sometimes there's a bit of fatigue. I have it with some podcasts I'm a fan of, and I'm like, oh, great, another episode on AI. Like, but at the same time, think particularly, and why I wanted to really focus on it in this series is because I think we are all scared of it because, it's like with any major change, people don't like change, right? They don't like not knowing what is coming. It was the same with maybe the industrial revolution, and then with the internet. And now we live in a time where we're just so connected that it feels just like an overflow of information. But I really like to highlight it in this context because I think it can really do a lot for how responsible this sector is. Because as you mentioned, there is not a shortage of, the collection of data and in a way, the availability of that. But what do we actually do with it then? How do we actually translate that into something meaningful? And I think that's why it is just a really exciting time for the sector, even though as just more of a person that, needs to have a job to make money and things. I am terrified of AI, yes, but I try to also just highlight the good things. And again, a bit of the nuance, right? Because we talk about the environmental footprint of all this, data storage and analysis. And in that way, it's not like AI is for free for the planet either. But if we could balance that with, at the same time, environmental innovations or things that technological innovations, I guess, that are going to benefit the environment, that maybe ultimately can balance each other out. Your work, also with some of the podcast episodes that you've done that I've listened to, you highlight that there is a lot of innovation in the sector. Are there any particular areas of aquaculture or maybe any challenges that we generally have in whether it relates to the environment or social aspects of aquaculture that you think are going to have the most transformative change in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, and I'll touch on a little bit of what you just mentioned, in my perspective on, being an optimist with this, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of the same way when you look back over time. Like, I think most people, yes, a lot of people, I myself included, reflect and talk about how the olden times was better, or, life was different back then. But I think most people would understand, today it's hard to live without the internet, and the internet is probably a net positive at the end of the day. I think you could have some
Mm-hmm.
very intense arguments over some drinks over whether that's the case
Oh,
or
for
not.
sure.
Exactly, right? And same thing with social media. Like, on one hand, it's not what we want to be looking at all the time. On the other hand, it's enabled people to connect from around the world in ways that wasn't possible before. And I think you could say the same about AI and kind of the spot we're in. But this gets us to kind of what's up next, right? Because I think what I see as kind of the biggest transformational changes, both that needs to happen and then that will happen, again, is a lot on that kind of genomics, biotech side. And then the last piece is on the regulation of what this industry looks like in the next 5 to 10 years. And the reason I think we're going to see the most change there is because it almost has to happen in a way.
Mm-hmm.
But if you follow the patterns of, in order to, when it comes to genomics and biotech, I think data and AI is changing those fields. And you're seeing it in human health. You're seeing it in fields like protein folding, vaccine development, pharmaceuticals. All of that side is developing very quickly on the backs of more data processing, on better kind of predictive engines. Again, you don't really see it out in the public. We hear about the LLMs and what these big AI companies are doing. In the private sector, there's a lot more of how you're applying these technologies into those types of fields. And I think we're going to see a lot of benefits in the human health sector. But of course, as I've mentioned, because of how far aquaculture has to go and what we can do in the ocean, there's a lot of potential there. And then on the next piece, it's really on the regulatory piece. And the way that I think people almost in the Western world maybe don't understand the scale and size of this industry. When you think about
Mm-hmm.
the fact that 1 in 7 people depend on seafood as their primary source of protein around the world. And when we see the aquaculture graphs and how quick they're growing and how much more fish is being farmed around the world, it's not happening in the Western world. And a lot of that is due to regulatory issues. But I think if we think about it and kind of your experience from a legal perspective, where does this go in the next 5 to 10 years? All we know is more fish is going to be necessary, whether that's wild caught fish or farmed fish. People need protein. Seafood is one of the most efficient kind of sources of that around the world. But how do we unlock this kind of regulatory barrier? Is it going to happen in third world countries and kind of Southeast Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, or are Western countries going to lead that kind of push into how we can adequately farm the ocean? You talked about kind of this balance with the ocean, sustainability criteria. Where does this kind of evolve in the next 5 to 10 years? We're at a point where we're going to need more production. The question is just going to be how it develops and how it comes to be. And again, what's the science and the biology that's going to be able to power all of this?
Yeah. And when you say it kind of needs to happen, are you referring then to the fact that aquaculture production just needs to grow because seafood production needs to grow and we know that we're kind of maxed out on the fisheries side?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I don't think any we can manage our fisheries better, but I don't think any expert
Mm-hmm.
in the world says that we can increase kind of fisheries harvest
No,
rates
exactly.
in any way, right?
Yeah.
Aquaculture has the potential to grow, and that's where If we're looking about supplying the world with protein, then you're in a conversation of, okay, is it more land animals? Is it eating more chickens? Is seafood and how is fish a part of that equation? And in many cases, I mean, I think could argue that fish is a much more efficient resource from that protein standpoint if we're just thinking at a very, very high kind of global level.
Yeah, at least from an emissions standpoint, I think it's been, of course, it depends a little bit on the species, but I think with so much innovation that we've seen in the last years with kind of the fish in, fish out ratio, like you'll see that seafood that we eat that comes from aquaculture is indeed a lot more efficient. And if we're talking about terrestrial animals, is there any topic that you wish people would pay a bit more attention to that you come across in your work and you're like, this needs a little bit more airtime, I feel?
I think it's almost just the understanding of where how food gets to people's tables. We talk to so many folks who tell me, I think in my travels, I think a common story is I love sushi, but I hate salmon farming. Like these are industrial farms. And I think that misconception is something that really highlights the knowledge that the average consumer understands. I don't think they know that almost all sushi, the salmon sushi comes from farmed salmon. There is no wild salmon sushi that really exists. And that misconception is something I don't think people are able to grapple with. And I think there's parts of it where the industry can do a better job of presenting itself, but also you would love for consumers to better understand kind of the realities of where their food comes from. And, when you're talking about some of these fish in, fish out issues, I think there's a lot of trying to hide some of these facts. I mean, it's in my head, it's things we got to have out in the open. And that's what I wish people would pay attention to more and have this airtime and understanding. We talk to a lot of people that say, yeah, aquaculture doesn't need to grow, or, believe that they can shut it down in specific industries or specific parts of the world. But again, the bigger picture that people need to understand is kind of what we just talked about. This is almost like in my head, it's like a runaway train. More seafood is going to be farmed, and it's just a question of where in the world it's going to come from, what species is going to be, and what countries basically allow it. But I don't see a world where the numbers come down, and that's something I wish more people around the world knew about.
Yeah, and I think that's something that applies to fisheries, like as well as aquaculture, where sometimes, the solution that people seem to offer is, oh, let's just stop eating it. It's like, oh, at some point there's nothing left if you're going to boycott everything. Plus, it's a very privileged position to come from. Like a lot of people don't have that option to say, oh, no more seafood, because like you say, 1 in 7 people in the world depends on it as the primary source of protein. And we know how important protein is for the body. There are misconceptions about this sector. Are there any others that maybe very specific misconceptions of people that maybe know a little bit more about aquaculture, but they still have a hard time believing something? Like, for instance, I have a lot of friends that will eat seafood or that will eat farmed seafood. I don't think aquaculture gets quite the bad rap in Europe as it does in the US sometimes, but they will still be like, oh, but I would never touch tilapia. And I'll be like, why? What's your argument? And they're like, well, I heard it's bad. Like, it was in a newspaper 10 years ago about how dirty the water was or something like that.
No, I mean, my personal experience comes from the salmon sector in that particular, almost exact same kind of case, right? We started with oyster farmers where, you can argue oysters are probably the most sustainable form of aquaculture possible,
it's
right?
amazing.
Protein production, filters and whatnot. That's how we started. And then we switched over to salmon, and then people really looked at us differently. Oh, you're in salmon farming. You're in the big kind of conglomerate factory farming industry full of diseases, etc. That's the perspective that people had on us. And for us as a business, we were like, this doesn't make any sort of sense, or like our mission has never changed. And what we wanted to do, you liked us whenever we did work with the filter feeders. But the second that we switched over to working with finfish farmers, we became kind of the enemy in the sustainability argument almost. And I think that is something that I wish people would also understand. You see a lot of industries, or a lot of, maybe not industries, but groups that go after salmon farming. And I think one of the misconceptions I'd love to highlight more is the fact that where do we expect, if we believe that aquaculture is going to grow, around the world. And part of those solutions is what I've mentioned, whether it's genomics, whether it's better feed, whether it's better equipment or technology. You got to have a place to be able to basically test that type of science. In order to do that, you have to have the budgets. They have to be making enough money to be able to spend on resources like that. I can't ask a farmer that's farming tilapia in Africa to pay for our systems when they're barely getting by on just their farms, right? So salmon is a great kind of innovation space for the industry. Obviously, yes, there's challenges with the species itself, and it can be done better, but as an industry, it is our innovation hub. It is the place where so much research and development can happen, simply because at the end of the day, people like to pay money or will pay more money for salmon than many of these other species, like you mentioned. This is where a lot of people attack salmon because it's bigger. It's they obviously make more money, but on the other hand, that's where so much of the high-end innovation is able to happen. I mean, I think you can make the same case for AI, right? Right now, the big tech companies are pretty much the only places that have the money to be able to innovate and to do the R&D necessary. The same thing needs to occur in our industry if we're really trying to get to those kind of next levels of efficiency.
Yeah. And I think it comes back again to, some of that nuance. It's like, yeah, may there be some challenges with the salmon industry? Yes. Are we aware of them? Yes. Will the innovation in this sector really help innovate the aquaculture sector in general? And there is just a bit more money because innovation costs a lot of money simply. So I think you ultimately have to just really look at the bigger picture. As you say, very often with innovation, it will kind of end up on the plate of the producer. And that is okay in some scenarios. But in case of smaller scale fisheries or aquaculture, that is unfair and also will just mean that it can't be done simply, not because they're unwilling, but business is a business. And if you can't, meet your bottom line, then it's going to be a big challenge. It's funny how you mentioned earlier with salmon that, maybe sometimes people aren't aware that when you are talking about salmon consumption, yes, you will very often just be talking about farmed salmon. Like I remember going to a dinner once with fellow fish nerds, and there was like wild salmon on the menu, and they ordered it because they simply didn't believe that it was actually wild salmon for that price on a menu in the Netherlands. So we did a little test. It was actually wild salmon in this case, but yeah, it is really rare. I've seen it maybe twice in a restaurant. I never quite believe in that approach where simply because there's problems, you're going to shut the door. Because if you're going to boycott, a certain direction that is going into now, it will end up somewhere else because, these facilities are expensive and there's always going to be a demand for it. So it's not like they will just magically stop producing. It will just mean that it will only go to customers or, customers in this case, their buyers that will simply not have any pressure to ask for them to be better. So you're only really going to make the problem worse because it's not just magically going to go away. I don't know. Maybe that's human error to think like that. Like, oh, if I just protest enough, like people will resolve this issue. But if you look at the market and how these industries work, it's very simplistic. I'm not very confident it's going to do anything.
Couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's where but I also, I mean, I would add like it's seafood has challenges on so many levels, right? It's there's small communities that used to be seafood communities that can't run the business at that scale anymore. But then you can bubble it up to many of the topics we're talking about here at kind of this whole global level. There's every level in between, whether it's countries or counties in the US, different states. People are trying to solve problems all up and down this chain. And it's easy for us to also say, hey, look higher and look bigger. But when you're struggling to put food on the table or to bring in, and harvest, things change. And that's where it's I think that's something also to really keep in mind. And I mean, it's what makes this industry exciting, I think, because everybody wants to solve these problems. Everyone can see that future in a sense in many aspects, but we're also solving problems. These can be very, very small neighborhood community problems that also come up, and it's important not to lose that perspective.
Yeah, very well said. I want to, before we wrap up, I want to make sure to dive a little bit deeper into AI. As you said, it's been a space you've been in for 10 years, which is quite impressive. Like at that time, a lot of people weren't really thinking about it. I for sure was not thinking about it. Could you, just set that scene a little bit better for us? And how do you see really that AI is going to help, shape the aquaculture practices now and maybe a little bit further into the future?
I can answer this kind of from a general AI point of view and kind of our perspective over the technology as a whole, not just in the industry, and kind of talk about how it applies into the industry. I think as a whole, I would say we're likely at a point where there's no true kind of silver bullet breakthroughs. Like, is it going to replace our jobs in the next 5 years? I highly doubt it, but I do think there will be small value adds over time. I think if we go back again from history, there's things, basically every idea that people thought about the internet back in the early 2000s or late 90s has basically come to fruition. The visions people had where you can order stuff, at a click of a button, then, you can do all this stuff and talk to people and have video chats online. These are all visions people had in the late 90s, but it took roughly 20 years for it to come to fruition. So I'd almost put that into perspective here. A lot of typically with technology, engineers see this future and want to build towards this future. And investors kind of see the value of that. And, it does make sense. How quickly that happens, however, it will take some time. So are we at a point where AI can do everything for us? No. Will that happen? Maybe in the next 10, 15, 20 years, we'll see more and more of it. But that's kind of our prediction as to how this will develop. And I think people see it today in how you use AI. You're starting to use it in small pieces, but it obviously can't replace everything that we do in many, many different cases. But small value adds over time. I think for us and what we see in the industry, it comes in a couple different areas. And one of the most important ones, and again, what we focus on as a business, is the predictability side of the industry. When you're dealing with fish, and I mean, whether you're in fisheries or in aquaculture, you all know it, huge swings, right? It's great season or poor season. It can go very extreme on either end. And some of that's just built into the biology of these animals, right? If you're going to lay millions of eggs expecting just a small handful to survive, you're going to deal with years with big swings. If you have a good year from a reproductive standpoint in a couple percentage points, you're talking about a very different population of fish, as well as, some environmental condition could also stress that. That's how they've evolved as a species. And we're trying to add in our predictability on top of it, right? We want constant harvest schedules. We want, inventory to stay available year round and be able to ship globally. So we're trying to almost fight biology in a sense to create a business and transparency around it. But I think this is where AI can really help. We can see patterns, predict things that are going to happen, whether that's a disease outbreak or better growth. We're trying to identify those patterns in the data to be able to help make this industry more predictable. Again, this isn't maybe the same AI that everyone kind of thinks about when they talk to ChatGPT, but that's what we're talking about. And then the other side of it is, I think there's also this aspect of where the technology is today. If we do talk about large language models, the ability to communicate around the world has changed, right? I can write an email in multiple different languages. And yeah, I'm not going to be the best writer, but you're going to understand what I'm saying if I'm speaking English or Spanish or Chinese at the end of the day. And in the world of seafood, that global commerce is super important, right? I don't know how many invoices we send across the world, and there's details and nuance that we don't understand. Even today's technology can help streamline a lot of that. And I think that's going to help the business as well. But that's where we're talking about small wins with AI, not necessarily huge transformative changes.
Yeah, it's interesting how you mentioned that, basically it will happen at different levels. We're not only talking about the production level, but also we are in a very global industry, like one of the most traded commodities globally. There's many countries that heavily depend on imports. That's very interesting and something I hadn't really thought about yet, even though I use it myself. Like, it's much easier for me to now work and like do my work in different languages and publish reports, for instance, in different languages than it was with, sending it to a translator and then they don't really understand the lingo and I can't really fact check it because, I don't speak Vietnamese. So I just, cross my fingers and hope I'm not sending anything ridiculous. Wrapping up, finally, I would like to ask you, What has really, you've talked to different experts, a big takeaway, or maybe the biggest takeaway of where this sector is heading? We talked a little bit about growth. We talked about overcoming some challenges that the sector has had. What are really your biggest takeaways here?
I think the biggest takeaway, especially talking with people and what drew us into this industry, is a lot of the optimism and opportunity that's available, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about it, even what you just mentioned, the fact that seafood's traded as the largest traded commodity around the world, whether aquaculture or wild caught, it's all kind of in that category. There's just so many problems to solve. And I think people
Mm-hmm.
do see, if we're able to solve these problems, kind of where this future really comes into. I think the amount of people that we found and who have such a passion for this small, particular area, whether it's studying a particular disease or developing a
Mm-hmm.
vaccine within the industry, you almost see more passion than maybe in other places and in other industries. And that's shared almost up and down the supply chain, whether you're talking to a trader or importer or somebody raising the fish, that level of enthusiasm behind the work that they do is shared across the industry. And I think that's what draws us in. I think that's what
Mm-hmm.
people will see when they come to this space, and for the most part, like to stay. We all want to be able to grow businesses and obviously put food on the table, but it's a community that once you're a part of, you don't really want to leave. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's
For
very
sure.
surprising that you find the same people around the world. It doesn't matter whether you're in a small town in the US who have oyster farmers raising oysters in their small acres, or if you go to the big kind of seafood conglomerates around the world, everyone kind of shares that exact same passion over how exciting the industry is and the work that they're doing. And you really don't find that everywhere else. But I think that's my biggest takeaway as far as where the sector is heading. Yes, there's going to be challenges. It's not an easy road, but the amount of people that are willing to get their boots dirty and to go and try to solve these is, I think, unique compared to everywhere else that I've seen.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I would say at this point I'm so deep in, and that's just after 10 years, that I couldn't leave if I wanted to, because I would just never see half of my friends again. Because if I'm not like going to these seafood conferences, etc. As we talked about, it's a very globalized sector. So, just meet and become friends with people from all over the world, which I think is just one of the great elements of it. So thank you, Tony, so much for talking today, and for also the work that you do, as someone who is also really focusing on understanding how we can better leverage all the data that we do have in seafood production to ultimately make this sector more responsible. It was really great to learn more about your experience, very much on the aquaculture side. And as always, appreciate the ability to shine a positive light on these things as well, which I think we can never have enough of. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.